The streets of Los Angeles turned into a stage for anger and fear in early June 2025. Protests erupted across the city, but they did not start without a reason. The main cause was a sudden and intense series of raids by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. These federal operations targeted undocumented immigrants, causing widespread panic in many communities. On a single day, June 4th, ICE arrested a record 2,200 people. Many of these individuals were part of a program called Alternative to Detention, which meant they were already being monitored by the government and were not considered a flight risk. This action felt like a betrayal to many families and community advocates who believed these individuals were following the rules set for them. The shock of these large-scale arrests quickly turned into organized resistance. People felt that the government's actions were aggressive and unjust. The protests began peacefully on Friday, June 6th. Families, activists, and concerned citizens gathered in public spaces, holding signs and chanting slogans. They wanted to show their solidarity with the detained immigrants and demand an end to the raids. The initial demonstrations were centered in areas like the Arts District and Little Tokyo, places with deep cultural and community roots. For the people marching, this was not just a political issue. It was a deeply personal one, affecting their neighbors, friends, and family members. They wanted their voices to be heard, hoping to draw national attention to their plight. As the weekend progressed, the atmosphere in some parts of the city grew more tense. The protests continued, but the response from law enforcement became more visible and forceful. While many demonstrators remained peaceful, some confrontations began to occur. Protesters, frustrated and angry, sometimes threw objects like water bottles and fireworks at police lines. In response, law enforcement officers, including the Los Angeles Police Department, started using crowd control measures. They declared some gatherings unlawful and began making arrests. This cycle of protest and police action created a volatile environment, setting the stage for a much larger conflict that would soon involve the federal government itself. The initial days of the protests highlighted a deep divide within the country. The Trump administration, with policy advisors like Stephen Miller, was determined to increase immigration enforcement, aiming for 3,000 arrests per day. They saw the raids as a necessary part of enforcing federal law. However, for many people in Los Angeles, a city where over a third of the residents are immigrants, the raids felt like an attack on the very fabric of their community. The sight of the Mexican flag, often seen at the protests, was a symbol of heritage and pride for many demonstrators. This clash of ideologies and the escalating tension on the streets created a crisis that would soon capture the nation's attention and test the limits of state and federal power. The situation in Los Angeles took a dramatic turn when President Donald Trump made a bold decision. He ordered the deployment of federal troops to the city without the approval of California's state leaders. This was a highly unusual move for handling a domestic protest. The president authorized up to 4,000 National Guard troops to be sent to Los Angeles to support ICE operations and federal law enforcement. By June 10th, about 1,700 of these troops were already on the ground. This military presence was meant to send a strong message that the federal government would not back down from its enforcement agenda, regardless of local opposition. The sight of soldiers in city streets was jarring for many residents. In addition to the National Guard, the administration took another extraordinary step. It activated 700 active-duty U.S. Marines and sent them to Los Angeles. Their stated mission was to protect federal personnel and federal property, such as courthouses and government buildings. The Marines were equipped with shields and batons for crowd control, but they did not have the authority to make arrests. This deployment of active-duty military for a domestic law enforcement situation was seen as a significant escalation. High-ranking officials in the Trump administration, like Vice President J.D. Vance and Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, defended the action. They said the administration would not be intimidated by lawlessness and that the troops were necessary to restore order. The arrival of federal forces changed the dynamic of the protests entirely. Law enforcement tactics became more severe. Officers used less lethal weapons to disperse crowds, including rubber bullets, flashbangs, stun grenades, and pepper balls. These encounters sometimes resulted in serious injuries. An Australian news reporter was hit and injured by a rubber bullet, and a British photographer needed emergency surgery after being shot with a non-lethal round. The U.S. Attorney General, Pam Bondi, announced that the Department of Justice was investigating instances of violence against officers and looting, stating, If California won't protect state officers, we will. This federal response was seen by some as a necessary measure to control the situation, but by others, as a heavy-handed overreach. This federal intervention was part of a broader strategy to assert federal authority over states with sanctuary policies. Los Angeles had officially become a sanctuary city in November 2024, which meant the city limited its cooperation with federal immigration agents. The Trump administration viewed these policies as an obstacle to enforcing immigration law. By sending in troops, the president was not just responding to the protests, he was directly challenging California's political leadership and its sanctuary status. The administration made it clear that the National Guard would remain in the city until there's no danger, signaling a potentially long and contentious federal presence in the heart of Los Angeles. California's leaders responded to the federal deployment with immediate and fierce opposition. Governor Gavin Newsom, a vocal critic of the Trump administration, did not hold back his anger. He described the president's decision to send troops into his state without his consent as un-American and dictatorial. He argued that the federal government was overstepping its constitutional boundaries and infringing on the rights of the state. To back up his words with action, Governor Newsom announced that California was filing a lawsuit against the Trump administration. The lawsuit sought to declare the deployment of the National Guard unconstitutional and to prevent any future deployments without the state's approval, setting up a major legal battle. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass echoed the governor's outrage. She argued that the situation in her city had been largely peaceful until the arrival of federal forces, which she believed had only inflamed tensions. Mayor Bass called Los Angeles a test case for federal overreach, suggesting that the administration was using the city to see how far it could push its authority. She condemned the acts of vandalism that had occurred, such as the damage to several Waymo self-driving cars, but insisted that these isolated incidents were being used as a pretext for a massive and unnecessary military presence. She felt the federal government was creating a trap, hoping to provoke a response that would justify its actions. The standoff created a deep political divide that reached the highest levels of government. In Washington, lawmakers were split along party lines. Some Republicans, like House Speaker Mike Johnson, strongly supported the president's actions. In contrast, many Democrats, including former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, accused the president of deliberately making the situation worse for political gain. The legal challenge from California raised important questions about the U.S. Constitution, specifically regarding the Posse Comitatus Act, which generally prohibits the use of the military for domestic law enforcement, and the 10th Amendment, which reserves certain powers for the states. This conflict between California and the federal government was about more than just the protests in Los Angeles. It was a fight over fundamental principles of American governance. It questioned who has the ultimate authority in a crisis, a state's elected leaders or the President of the United States. Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass positioned themselves as defenders of states' rights and local control against what they saw as an authoritarian power grab. The Trump administration, on the other hand, framed its actions as a necessary defense of federal law and national security. The outcome of this standoff would have significant implications for the balance of power between states and the federal government for years to come. For the people living in Los Angeles, the first week of protests and the federal response created a confusing and tense reality. While news reports focused on the dramatic confrontations, much of the sprawling city continued with its daily rhythm. However, in downtown Los Angeles, the atmosphere was completely different. The constant presence of police, National Guard soldiers, and media crews transformed familiar neighborhoods. Residents living in the affected areas described the military presence as excessive and a waste of money. The sound of helicopters overhead and sirens in the distance became a new, unsettling soundtrack to their lives. The fear caused by the ICE raids lingered, making many immigrant families afraid to leave their homes. The impact of the Los Angeles protests rippled across the country. Inspired by the events in LA, solidarity protests sprang up in many other U.S. cities. From San Francisco to New York, and from Dallas to Atlanta, people gathered to show their support for the LA demonstrators and to protest against ICE policies in their own communities. In San Francisco, 150 people were arrested at a similar protest. Labor unions also organized demonstrations in cities like Boston and Seattle, calling for the release of a union leader who had been detained during the LA protests. These nationwide rallies showed that the concerns raised in Los Angeles were shared by many Americans. Public opinion on the situation was deeply divided. Supporters of the administration's policies argued that the government was simply enforcing the rule of law, and that sanctuary cities like Los Angeles were undermining national security. However, many others, including some who had voted for Trump, felt that the tactics were too aggressive and arbitrary. The sight of military forces on American streets was disturbing to people across the political spectrum. Celebrities like Mark Ruffalo and Finnis used their platforms to voice support for the protesters, while the ACLU of Southern California raised alarms about the treatment of those who had been detained, citing reports of overcrowding and lack of access to lawyers. Ultimately, the events in Los Angeles served as a powerful reminder of the deep divisions in the country over immigration and the role of government. The situation was not just a local news story, it was a national one that touched on core issues of law, rights, and humanity. It highlighted the fear and uncertainty faced by immigrant communities, the power of protest, and the profound consequences of a government willing to use its military might to enforce its policies on its own soil. What happened in Los Angeles in June 2025 became a critical moment, forcing people everywhere to consider what kind of country they wanted to live in.